You're listening to Storystruck. I'm Rachel, an editor and writing coach.
And I'm Nino, a ghostwriter and book coach. Welcome to our curious community where we dive into everything books and writing.
Now, let's get into the episode.
Welcome to the Storystruck podcast. Nino is on a much-needed vacation this week, and I have the pleasure then of getting to monopolize Deborah's time. We have Deborah Morton here today, and she is graciously returning after a technical snafu, so we're going to try and recreate the magic for everybody. Deborah, could you introduce yourself for our audience, please?
Sure. My name is Deborah Morton, and I'm with DLM Editing, and I do structural work and developmental work and coaching when I do an edit. And so we're here to talk about that process and how that works out.
And Deborah, I would love to hear how you got into the writing and editing world.
I started out writing children's books, and once my grandkids that I was writing the books for originally grew up, I decided that I wanted to go adult. And so I've moved into writing adult books. My first adult book was a women's fiction, and that went really well. But then I got this idea in my head for a story about a woman with a pirate in her dreams, and it turned into a trilogy. And so that's where I am at the moment.
That is awesome. I am a sucker for anything like pirate and pirate adjacent, so I cannot wait for when those books come out because I want to read them.
Pretty soon. It's coming right up.
So you mentioned that you do structural editing. So I know a lot of people have heard the term like developmental edit, copy edit, and proofreading. And even amongst those, there's a lot of confusion. Could you tell me a little bit more about what structural editing is and what the value of having one is?
Absolutely. So with a structural edit, the very first thing that you're going to look at is if you have a complete story. It's the first step in deciding whether you even need a structural edit, because if you don't have a complete story, then you're going to need to do some more developmental work and finish your story before you move on. So in order to figure that out, you need to ask yourself some questions. Does this story have a beginning, a middle, and an end? And I know this sounds super simplistic, but you'd be surprised how many people discover after taking a closer look at their draft that their story didn't even have a clear beginning, or maybe the middle kind of got a little funny, or when they ended it, it's not really an ending. So it's more complex than you might think. But if you answer no, you've still discovered something. And whatever's missing, you've identified it, and you can move on and just get your story finished. However, if you answer yes, I have a complete story, then I got to say, hey, congratulations, you're ready to move on. So before we move on, there's something important that I want to say that's before we do that. And I just want everybody to hear this, because this is the hardcore truth, that no story emerges from your mind to the page in perfect condition. And so it's not a failure to see that your story is full of typos and missing commas. And, you may have things that should have been at the beginning of a scene instead of at the end of the scene. All that comes out in a structural edit, not so much the missing commas, but where everything was supposed to present itself in the story at the right time. That's what the structural edit is for. And you make sure that you have full-blown characters, full-blown plots with a full-blown setting, and so your story is three-dimensional and ready to go.
That's awesome. Yeah, one of our guests that we had on recently, she was talking to us about the imperfect first draft and was like, basically, the only reason for that first draft, the only purpose is for it to exist. And then we're going to iterate from there, take a look at all of those elements. And you made up you made a really great point when you were talking about seeing if your story really is a complete story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. I see a lot of people that come to me and posing questions of, did I even start my story in the right place? Like, I feel like I got lost, or did I really end it? Did I deliver on what I was supposed to do? And, also confusion of if they're writing a series, like, how do I have a complete arc when I have a series and it's going to continue, and things like that. And so that's where a structural edit is so helpful, and where some of the things that we're going to touch on in a little bit will help you kind of see, do you actually have that complete story? And I think that this works really well for both the plotters and the pantsers. And I recently had a pantser tell me at the summit I presented in, she's like, I'm a pantser, but you made me into a pantser with a plan. And I just freaking loved that, because
That
just
is
because you have a
awesome.
plan, it doesn't restrict your creativity. It's just, right, if I want to go from New York to California, like, I need to know kind of how I'm going to get there. Or I may, what was supposed to take me like a 1 week trip is going to take me 3 or 4 weeks. I'm getting super lost. But if I have those benchmarks of where I want to go, then I can look at, ooh, I want to hit this yarn store, or I want to see the Grand Canyon. I know those little things. Like, I still have the freedom to go on those side trips, but I know the general direction of where I'm going.
Absolutely. By having that direction, that's part of the structural edit, is that it will shape your story and clarify your meaning, enhance those intentions, and improve the readability. And that all strengthens everything else. It strengthens the characters, it tightens the plot, and inflates the settings, can capture the reader's emotions as they turn the page.
Awesome. And before we dive into kind of the nuts and bolts of a structural edit, can you explain to me what the difference is between a structural edit and a developmental edit? And does one have to happen in a particular time, or do they happen kind of together?
Well, a little both. In my program, but when somebody comes to me, the first thing I look at is just the overall bird's eye view of this thing. And I can see pretty quickly if it could use some development in different areas depending on, what that is. And so I like to have my clients address those developmental issues first before we go further into the structural edit. Now, at the same time, we may not see those developmental issues until we get there. So there could be some structural stuff that's going on, and that will actually deliver a message that says, hey, wait a minute, this is feeling a little flat. So let's see what we can do to puff that up a bit. So it kind of can go before and during, hopefully not after. But the other two, yes, it could go either way.
Okay, great. So now I would love to kind of really dig into that structural edit. And I know that you mentioned that there are really three key features, and I just thought this was the most brilliant thing ever. And anytime I write, I'm thinking about this now. So can't hold them in suspense any longer. Tell me, what are the three key features?
So the three key features are a strong backbone. Now, this is the story goal. This is going to hold up every word on every page. So that's the biggest thing that has to happen. So that's the strong backbone. We'll talk about a skeleton blurb later. I almost went into that, but we'll wait. The second key thing is the heartbeat. This is the consistent rhythm that comes through the strength of your scenes and well-developed chapters. This is that kind of beat that's going along as you're reading. And then the last thing is the steady breath. This is the character's journey, whether they're going with successes or falling with failures. These are, if you can think of them as big inhalations and exhalations, you've got this sort of steady breath that's going along in your story. So your story is held up with a strong backbone, a consistent heartbeat, and a steady breath. That will get you there.
I love that. Oh my goodness. That is just glorious. So now let's dive into what the skeleton blurb is.
Okay.
If
Let's
I'm
do that.
jumping ahead of the game, let me know. You tell me where we go next.
It's actually better because the skeleton blurb should come first
Okay.
anyway. And I just kind of was thinking about the key scenes, but having the skeleton blurb will actually help you set the key scenes.
Okay.
So the skeleton blurb is it's a pretty simple, a pretty simple little tool, but for me personally, I believe it is the strongest tool in your toolbox. And what it is that it's the protagonist and their goal, so what they must accomplish, and the stakes if they're unsuccessful. So if they don't accomplish that, what's going to happen is what's going to make everything fall apart. So you want to boil your story down into this one small sentence that says whoever your protagonist is must do whatever their story goal is. Otherwise, this will happen. And that's the stakes. It sounds simple enough, but it's not as simple as you think. And it's a little harder to kind of do that. With a skeleton blurb, there are actually two lines to a story. There's a plot line and there's a storyline. The storyline tends to be a little more internal. They want to find happiness or that type of thing. But the external is more the plot line. That's where they go to get what they want. And the skeleton blurb needs to marry those two things together. And so, and when you write the skeleton blurb, there is a bit of a formula for it. It should be somewhere between 15 and 25 words. And that seems to be a sweet spot for people. It gives enough information that will allow enough into your story that you can allow into the story. And yet, if you have it too long, it'll let you allow too much into the story. And if you have it too short, is it the other way around? If it's too short, it'll let you bring in too much into the story. But if it's too long, it constricts what you can put in your story because every single scene has to relate to the skeleton blurb. So if your skeleton blurb is, a couple paragraphs long, it really restrains you from being able to write in what you need to write in to make a great, unique story. On the other hand, if it's too short, you can just dump everything in there and, you're not on a clear path. You can be going off in a lot of different directions. So there's a nice happy medium that I find is about 15 to 25 words that will get you there.
And I think that skeleton blurb kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast of being able to see if they have a story and, is there one there? And this is that benchmark that they can use to see, all right. And I know that that's kind of what you're going to talk about in those next key scenes of kind of how that all plays together. So I know, like you were saying, that this sounds fairly simple, but it can be very challenging. And I've noticed that like with myself when I was trying to work on mine and I'm like, oh, I got this, and I put it in there and I'm like, whoa, like it was like really, really long and it was kind of all over the place. And then I tried to like shorten it here, but then I'm like, okay, but the stakes weren't quite enough. Like it didn't have that emotional aspect. So it had kind of one-sided where it had the plot versus the plot and the story in there. So it felt like it was kind of flat. So I just want to encourage people to play around with it, write a whole bunch of versions, and like you'll get there eventually. Each version you do is going to give you a little bit of a different look at it. And then you might find, ooh, it's better if I blend this with this one I had over here because those two parts are perfection together. And I think too, as I mentioned, perfection, that, right, this isn't about being perfect. And this isn't something they're necessarily using for their marketing. Is that correct?
That's true. The skeleton blurb is your tool as the writer, as the author for your toolbox. It's never going to go on the back of your book or in the little flap on the side. This is just something strictly for you so that you can write a fantastic story.
And I think when I have, knocking my mic around, when I have mine and I'm writing, I actually have it like right by me on a Post-it note. And so it's just kind of, it just goes in my head every time, like I'm doing a chapter or a scene or I'm, plotting stuff out. I'm like, okay, does it go back to that? Yes, it does. All right, let's keep going.
Yeah. And, the thing is, the story goal is what's key throughout your story from the beginning to the end. So if you ever have a scene that doesn't, that in that skeleton blurb, you have the story goal. And so if you ever have a scene that you just can't relate to that to your story goal, it's better to find out right then because everything that you write after that, if it wasn't part of your story goal, can take you off in a very different direction. And one of the things I hear a lot from people was I was starting to write a story that was going to be this, and then it turned into this. And my first thought is, okay, why is that? And it's more than likely because they got off track with their true story goal.
Yep. Yep. And it's better to find that out in the beginning kind of testing it out
Mm.
with this than, being halfway through the book, three quarters are all the way done. And you're like, whoops, you're making a lot more work
Here's
for yourself.
Exactly, but here's the really nice thing about the Skeleton Blurb is that if you didn't know about it and you've already written your book, it's still not too late to write your Skeleton Blurb. And so in your edits and your revisions, you can use it at that point. You can bring it in the middle and make sure you're good to go so far and finish it off. It doesn't really matter when you bring it in, but once you've used it and you get used to it, then it becomes second nature that's got to get checked each time.
Yes, that's fantastic advice. Yeah, because like you said, now that you have that, even if you've already written, that's going to make your editing go so much smoother. You're not going to be second guessing yourself as much of, ooh, does this stay? Does this go? Am I missing something? Now you have that, kind of North Star to guide you along and keep you on
Mhm.
track during your
Absolutely.
revisions.
Yes, absolutely.
So now I would love to dive into those five key scenes because now we know the three features that we have to have. We have our skeleton blurb, and now we're ready for our key scenes.
So I've started talking recently about adding the opening
Hmm.
before you even get to that first key scene and how important that opening is. That's that book promise, which is also going to be suggesting the story goal and where we're going with this. And so, but it's not, a lot of people feel like that first part is going to be backstory, and it's not backstory. It's actually now story. You want to set your person in or persons, whether you're single or multiple protagonists, in their day to day life that's normal for them. Because when they hit that inciting incident, that is when the rug gets pulled out from under them. That is the point where everything changes, and there's no way that they can just simply ignore it and keep going in their regular day to day. Their status quo changes at the inciting incident. So that happens, and it should happen before the first 15%. 15% is really kind of getting towards the far end.
Mm.
Mine generally end up somewhere around 6 to 10%. And some can actually happen before the book starts. So in the Bourne series, Inciting Incident was happened before he started, and the book was set up on how him trying to figure out why he has no memory. Where's that going? So that's the inciting incident. It happens somewhere either before the book starts, all the way up to 10-15% being on the outside. The next thing that you'll get to is plot point one. That is where the protagonist grasps the story goal and agrees to take part. They maybe even make a plan of where they're going to go forward from here. So that some people refer to that as the no going back point, but for me personally, I feel like the inciting incident is the no going back point.
Yeah, that's what I
And
feel like too.
the plot point one is that first moment where they go, okay, this is what I'm going to do to now, try to get my normal back to normal or to a new normal or whatever's got to happen. The other part to that is that it may not be their right decision. And that may change as the story goes on, and that's okay too. But it's the point where they're starting to make things happen as opposed to things just happening to them. And so that is plot point one. Then you have the middle. And at that point, the protagonist can maybe see a plot, or sometimes it's about them letting go of the past, or they make some giant decision. If it's sometimes in fantasies, it's where they meet their antagonist and have their first battle. That's that middle point where things shift. Plot point two is where nothing's going right. Everything they've tried is failed. And it's that moment where they go, how are we going to get through to there's just running out of ideas here, and the reader is sitting there going, how on earth are they going to get out of this one? So that is plot point two. And then the climax is when the plan comes together and they may actually still not be successful. It depends on how your ending is. But that is that final showdown. It doesn't mean they always win, but it's the completion that matters.
Excellent. And I love that you brought up that the inciting incident can happen before the book starts, because that's another question that I get all of the time is I feel like my inciting incident starts before, but they tell me I always have to start with the normal life at the beginning. And I'm like, no, 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 no. So can you talk a
Yeah.
little bit more about that for folks? And does that kind of shift around where we would place the maybe plot point one in the book? Is that going to come earlier if our inciting incident is before the book starts?
I would say, because the plot point one, and I didn't actually talk about where the rest of the come. So the plot point one generally comes at about 25% of the story, can come in as early as 20%. If you've got a inciting incident that started before the book starts, I wouldn't put the plot point one much closer than 20% to the beginning still, because you want it to balance through the rest of the book. And if the reader is unaware of what was going on before the book started, you're going to need that time to bring them up to speed. And so in why things are happening the way they are now. And I talk about backstory. Sometimes there can be a back with that type of thing that will help you to key them in, or some of that backstory might need to be brought in, but in a very delicate way. You don't want to just lay out a whole bunch of backstory. Maybe a few hints can come in to play through dialogue or in some type of narration, but you don't want to just load up with a bunch of backstory, even if your inciting incident happened before the book started.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I feel like a lot of times writers think we have to give the reader all of the information. We just have to dump it all. But there's something about the reader discovering it, as it goes along. It adds a little bit more tension. It adds more interest. If you
Yes.
think a lot of times about like fantasy novels and things like that, you're starting like kind of in the action in the world, and you don't have to get like this 30-page lowdown of these are all the different types of, orcs and elves and different things, and this is how the magic system works, and this is what happened to get us here. You're just fully immersed in that world. And it's
Mhm.
just kind of exciting to get that and then to work that backstory in naturally and in a way that doesn't feel overwhelming to the reader, where they're like, I need a nap because, like, I just took in
Right.
so much, like, my brain can't
Right.
function.
And more than likely, they won't remember what
Yes.
it was. They won't remember who all these people are and all these new places that they've never heard of and all of these different. So you just want to like I said, very delicately add a few things in. They're discovering as they read. That's why they're reading. They want to discover, they want to see that story unfold in front of them and not just be dumped on when they first open the book.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you'd like to chat about before we wrap up for today?
Just so obviously the middle goes at the middle, and the plot point two goes around 75%. So those three plot points, or those three key scenes, fall at the 25, 50, and 75 mark. But you've got that inciting incident that goes somewhere in that, before that. And then you've also got the climax that comes after plot point two, but you don't want that to be at the very, very end of the book. You don't want that to be your ending, right? You need a little bit of resolution. So that can come somewhere between, say, 85 and 90, 95% of the book. So you've got a little bit of something to let the reader take their breath now that the whole story has completed. Yeah. So
I'd love to
that
ask you one more follow-up question to that, because I know you said that you have your 3-book series. So if somebody is writing a series, kind of what is your advice of having a climax for a book when you know it's going to continue in a series?
So when you write a series, you're going to have an overarching sort of, I don't want to call it outline, but it is a little bit of an outline from the first book to the last book. It's always kind of nice to know, especially with a closed series, how many books it's going to be. And it's easier to sort of sort that out. But when you write a series, the first book is pretty much and should be a standalone. You don't want to leave you want to leave the reader in that first book satisfied, because they may have to wait a while before they get to the second book, and you haven't really completely hooked them in yet. You want to give them a satisfying ending in that first book. With mine, I have a very satisfying ending for the reader, but I left a few strings intentionally. And so when the second book starts it moves through into what ends up being the final tale of the last book. And I do leave that second book on a bit of a cliffhanger. Not too much. There's still some resolution there, but there is obviously more to come. And then the third book, they're 2 books into it, they're going to read the third book, right? So you
Yeah.
don't have to so completely close them out, because you do want them to come back for that third book, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's fantastic. It makes me think, just like the example of the Hunger Games came to mind. So even if we just think about the movies, if you haven't read the books, we have in the first one, right? It's the first Hunger Games, complete start to there. They're home, it's concluded, but there's this lingering tension of things. And the second
Yep.
book is a little bit more at the end, or the second movie, where you're like, oh crap, the story is continuing, but you're hooked now. You're in that second one. The third is coming, where you're going to have that final, completion of everything.
Yes, and that's a perfect example of that. So if you have an open series, it's a little bit different,
Hmm.
and you want to complete each book as you go along. You don't really want to keep stringing somebody along for an endless amount of time, right? So you kind of need to know what it is that you're after. If you're going to have an open series that will just go on and on and on and on and on, you will have these little sort of nuggets of stories that happen within the book, with some overreaching that, so that you can continue it. But some books, some open series, you can just open up any book in the series and
Yeah.
read it, and it's standalone. Some are not. So there's different kinds of ways to set that up before. But the important part is that if you are going to write a series, to have a sense of what's to come so that you can set yourself up for that. My book, I wasn't originally going to be a series, but it ended up into 3. Yeah.
That's really cool. Yeah, I think, take a look at your genre and see, like, if your genre has series, how authors are kind of setting those series up, kind of like you said, like fantasy, types of things like that. Usually it's a continuation of story, where like cozy mystery, each book is kind of its own thing. Like, it makes me think of when you watch TV, is it an episodic, where it's just like each book is like an episode, or
Yeah.
is it serialized where you have to keep following it? And so taking a look at your genre you're writing in, and see what the
Mhm.
expectations are within that, because that's also important to make sure that, you're doing a serial or a series as your audience is expecting it to be.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was thinking of Dragons of Pern. I don't know if you're familiar with that
No, I've heard, but I
series,
have
but
not read that series.
it's more than one series within the series. And it's done really well, but she has stuff that just goes on and on and on. But every single book in her series has a moment of completion, even though it's an open series. And, you know, but at any point you can say, okay, I've had enough of this. It's huge.
Awesome. Well,
Gives
Deborah, I
you
want to
exit
thank
books.
you so much for coming back and talking with, well, I said with us, with me, with us. Nino's here.
Yes, it's
So thank you
spirit.
for
She's
coming
here.
back. Yeah, she's here. She's wishing to be here with us today. Are there any final thoughts or places you would like to direct people to find you, or things you've done?
Well, I'm going to be publishing my series with the pirate. It's in the midst of getting renamed, and so I don't want to really put anything out there. I discovered that it was supposed to be the Dream series, and there's a romance dream series that I don't want to confuse it with. And the first book was Pirate Dreams only because it was simple for me to put PD on my work in progress. And so it's not really the best title. So I'm working on that kind of stuff now, and covers and that sort of things. When it's ready to come out, dlmortonbooks.com is my landing page if you're looking to find out when they're coming out. You can look there. I also have DLM editing. If you're looking for an edit, you can get a hold of me there. And I'm working with Story Origin, and I'm not sure, I'm not techie at all. So, but I think that's some way that you can find my books. Other than that,
No problem. And I will make sure that I keep the updated links in the show notes for the episode. So if anything changes, just shoot them my way. And then we will always have the most up-to-date links for listeners to be able to check everything out.
that's great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. All right. Well, everybody, have a great day and go write something that lights you up.
Thank you for listening. Check out the show notes for details and links from the episode. And don't forget to subscribe and follow for more. Special thanks to our composer, Micah Silverstein. Enjoy the rest of the music.